Picking up from our last discussion on historical realism as a form of satire, we now turn to how this perspective manifested in the work of Jacob Burckhardt. His narrative wasn't just about dates and events, it was fundamentally a story of decline. Think of it like watching a once magnificent sculpture slowly crumble into dust. For Burckhardt, the historian's job wasn't to rebuild that sculpture, or even to tell a heroic tale about its creation. It was simply to look at the fragments, the ruins, and hear the faint echo of what was lost. The historian's solemn duty to remember, but crucially not to invent inspiring fables for today's activists, nor to find grand universal laws promising a bright future. That was off limits. Now, where did this intense focus on decline lead Burckhardt? Well, straight into the arms of Schopenhauer's pessimism. He saw history reflecting the essence of tragedy, but not the kind that ends with catharsis. No, this was the deep dark well of Schopenhauer, the conclusion that existence itself is fundamentally flawed and perhaps, as he famously put it, better never to have been born. Life's joy? Reserved for those ancient enlightened souls, not for us moderns. He could imagine a cultural rebirth someday, maybe, but only if it happened by some cosmic accident, not through any conscious effort by people like us. What he saw coming wasn't progress. It was just more wars, endless squabbling between political factions, leading nowhere good. Sound familiar? Interestingly, his gloomy forecast mirrored Oswald Spengler's later predictions, though they arrived at it through different intellectual paths. Burckhardt wasn't optimistic about human agency changing the course. So, if the world is doomed and action is futile, what's the plan? Burckhardt prescribed a very specific response for the sensitive soul, basically anyone who felt the weight of this historical burden. The advice? Go underground. Think of it as historical hibernation. Cultivate your own garden, focus on what you can control, your personal intellectual pursuits. Remember things past, keep that connection to the lost greatness alive. And most importantly, wait. Wait for the current madness, the wars and strife, to burn itself out. Perhaps, just perhaps, after some kind of holocaust, culture might spontaneously revive. In the meantime, withdraw from the messy city life, head to the countryside, engage in thoughtful conversations with a select few kindred spirits, and maintain a consistent, polite disdain for those practical men who are busy trying to fix things. It's a strategy of withdrawal and quiet endurance, not engagement. But hold on, wasn't Burckhardt completely hopeless? Not entirely. Beneath the pessimism there was a flicker, a germ of faith in humanity's ultimate potential. He loved life too much to just give up on the Enlightenment dream of culture altogether. As the philosopher Croce pointed out, Burckhardt's problem wasn't intellectual, it was moral. He had, like many pessimists, what Croce called an unsatisfiable hedonism. He wanted the best of both worlds, the joy of life, the beauty of culture, but couldn't reconcile it with the perceived grim reality of his time. This internal conflict, this inability to face the harshness of the world and actively work to preserve what he valued, was what made him want to flee rather than fight. His books and his life became in a way artistic defenses of art itself. This brings us to a key distinction. Despite his aesthetic leanings, Burckhardt wasn't just some dilettante twiddling his thumbs. He was a sharp analyst, deeply attuned to the cultural pressures of his age. He understood the dynamics of decline. But here's the crucial difference. He desperately wanted to justify his retreat, his flight from the world, using grand historical arguments. He saw the trajectory of history. He knew it was heading downhill, but he lacked the will to actually do something about it. He saw the sickness but didn't have the strength to perform the surgery. This fundamental lack of will, this inability to translate insight into action, is precisely where he diverged from his friend and colleague Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche, we'll see, had the will, even if he didn't always have the optimism. Okay, let's shift gears slightly and zoom out to the broader intellectual landscape of the 19th century, specifically concerning the philosophy of history. Back in the 18th century, things were relatively simple. They saw three types of history writing: true history, which was factual; fabulous history, which was imaginative; and satirical history, which was critical. Philosophy of history was just thinking deeply about what the true history meant for humanity. But the 19th century got more complicated. Suddenly, there was a huge emphasis on separating true historiography, the actual writing of history, from philosophy of history, the big picture theorizing. Why? Because true history, according to this new orthodoxy, had to be rigorously factual, presented objectively, free from contemporary biases, and definitely not contaminated by abstract philosophical ideas that might distort the facts. It needed to stand on its own feet empirically. Hegel, that towering figure, tried to bridge this gap. He acknowledged the difference between just writing history and philosophizing about it. But he was more interested in analyzing how philosophy could bring order to the chaos of historical accounts. He even categorized different forms of historical writing: universal, pragmatic, critical, conceptual, suggesting a kind of taxonomy. However, despite Hegel's efforts, his specific classification didn't really catch on as a standard way to categorize the actual historical work produced throughout the century. Historians were distinguishing between national histories and world histories, between primary sources and reconstructions, sure. But the big divide remained that between the supposedly objective, factual account and the philosophizing or ideological interpretation. So, what was the central battle line in 19th century historiography? It was this sharp distinction between what counted as a true account of the past and what didn't. On one side, you had the true history camp demanding strict adherence to facts. On the other side, you had two main offenders. First, the philosophy of history, which imposed preconceived notions of what must have happened based on grand theories. And second, the doctrinaire or ideological history, which argued for what should have happened based on political or moral agendas. The mainstream historians basically said, "Look, we need facts, not fantasy or propaganda." They stressed that true history couldn't be built purely on artistic whim or the desire to discover universal laws like in physics. Now, this doesn't mean they thought history was purely factual and dry. The dominant school believed that a good historical account needed elements of science, philosophy, and art. But here's the catch. They insisted these weren't the heavy-duty versions from the early 19th century. The science wasn't positivist, obsessed with quantifiable data. The philosophy wasn't idealist, focused on grand metaphysical systems. And the art wasn't romantic, all about subjective feeling and projection. Instead, they leaned on something more classical, more Aristotelian. Think empirical observation, a realistic view of the world, and mimetic art, imitation, trying to capture reality as it was rather than expressing inner feelings or projecting ideals onto it. It was a kind of commonsensical, conventional approach, aiming for a balanced mix without leaning too heavily into any single modern discipline. Of course, this doesn't mean positivism, idealism, and romanticism vanished. Far from it. Thinkers like Comte Buckle and Taine championed positivism, Leo Strauss, Feuerbach, and others pushed idealism, and figures like Chateaubriand, Carlyle, Froude, and Trevelyan embodied romanticism. These schools were definitely around and influential. But from the perspective of the main line of professional historians, these weren't legitimate approaches. They were seen as deviations, as falling back into the very philosophical traps that professionalism was supposed to avoid. The goal of establishing history as a distinct autonomous discipline was partly driven by the desire to purge these other, more speculative or ideologically charged influences. Within this main line of professional historiography, however, there were still different flavors, often labeled as national schools Prussian, French, English, or political ones conservative, liberal, radical, socialist. These labels weren't necessarily about abandoning the core principles of true history. Rather, they indicated different areas of focus, different subject matters, or perhaps different ways of seeing the immediate relevance of history to the society the historian was writing for. Think of them as different specializations within the same field. Crucially, these weren't seen as fundamentally threatening the project of writing true history in the same way that overarching philosophies of history were. This distinction was so widely accepted that, when major surveys of the field appeared around the turn of the 20th century, Feuder, Gooch, and Croce, they all took this separation for granted. Let's quickly look at these three major surveys. Feuder saw four phases: romantic, liberal, realist, and scientific. Croce predictably set up a contrast: flawed schools like romantic, idealist, positivist versus his own new historiography. Gooch used the standard national/subject matter categories, but framed his era's task as synthesizing everything into a proper historical science. What united them, despite their differences, was a common lament. They all complained that philosophy of history or theory of history hadn't kept pace with actual historical research. They wished for some grand synthesis, some set of general laws or methods for historical analysis, something like Darwin provided for biology. Feuder hoped for a historical Darwin, Gooch stressed the need to unify traditions, and Croce thought he'd already done it. Here's where it gets really interesting, and a bit frustrating. When you read these three major surveys, you'd almost miss two of the most important thinkers of the entire period: Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche. How come? Feuchter barely mentions Marx once and Nietzsche only to point out his differences from Burckhardt. Gooch tosses their names out in passing remarks. Croce completely ignores Nietzsche and dismisses Marx as just another romantic. It's like reviewing a blockbuster movie and forgetting to mention the two actors who stole the show. Yet all three authors spend significant time complaining about the lack of a proper theory of history. It's almost as if they recognized the problem, but couldn't quite bring themselves to acknowledge the two guys who were arguably wrestling with it most intensely. Before we get to Marx and Nietzsche, let's pause at a pivotal moment: 1868. The Prussian historian Johann Gustav Droysen published his massive work, Historic. Think of it as his attempt to create a systematic anatomy of historical thinking, much like Aristotle had done for rhetoric and logic. His ambition was huge: to lay out the different ways historians could interpret the past, and the different ways they should represent those interpretations. He wanted to provide the field with its own foundational grammar and methodology. The title itself, Historic, hints at this grand project, an encyclopedia of historical knowledge. Droysen identified four main modes of interpretation. First, the biographical, focusing on individuals and psychology. Second, the pragmatic, looking for causes and effects. Third, the conditional, examining the broader social, cultural, and natural context. And fourth, the interpretation of ideas, which is roughly equivalent to ethical or teleological approaches, looking at moral progress or decline. What's fascinating is that Droysen, writing in the mid-19th century, already sensed the coming crisis. He saw that the very success of historians producing diverse, detailed accounts was creating a problem. How could all these different stories be reconciled? He started from the assumption that history was its own unique discipline, separate from science, philosophy, and art. But he was writing in a different intellectual climate than the earlier part of the century. Droysen broke down the historian's work into three parts, mirroring the tripartite nature we discussed earlier. First, methodic, the scientific part, gathering evidence. Second, systematic, the philosophical part, organizing and analyzing that evidence. Third, topic, the artistic part, representing the findings. The crucial point is that the interpretation problem pops up right at the beginning, in the methodic phase. How you choose to look at your evidence determines everything that follows. If you focus on individuals, you lean biographical. If you hunt for causes, you're pragmatic. If you analyze context, you're conditional. If you look for moral meaning, you're interpreting ideas. These choices shape the entire enterprise. Then comes the third stage, representation. How do you tell the story? Droysen identified four modes. Three of them, interrogative, didactic, discussive, involve the historian actively inserting themselves between the reader and the subject, trying to guide the reader towards a specific conclusion or emotional response. These are less about objective history and more about persuasive communication. The fourth mode, recitative, which Droysen championed as the ideal for true historiography, is different. It aims to imitate the actual flow of events, to create a narrative that feels like a living process. But crucially, Droysen stressed this wasn't about creating a perfect mirror image or letting the documents speak for themselves. Documents are dumb without a narrator to make them speak. And the goal wasn't mere objectivity, but justness, the honest effort to understand. This justness manifests in different ways depending on the interpretation chosen earlier. Droysen linked these directly to literary genres, even though he denied it explicitly. The biographical interpretation, focusing on individual genius, naturally leads to a romance plot. The monographic, looking at destiny and unfolding laws, fits tragedy. The catastrophic, showing the birth of new societies from conflict, aligns with comedy. And the pragmatic, highlighting the rule of law and fate, corresponds to satire. Each mode of exposition reflects a different understanding of the forces driving history: individual will, moral law, social struggle, or natural necessity. While Droysen tried to distance himself from direct literary parallels, the connections are undeniable. This fourfold structure Droysen proposed wasn't unique. We see similar patterns elsewhere. Hegel had his four species of reflective history. Croce and Feuilleter used fourfold schemes to classify historical thought. Wilhelm Dilthey developed his own system. And of course, Nietzsche famously categorized historical consciousness into four types in his Use and Abuse of History. Why this recurring pattern? It likely reflects the dominant cultural movements of the 19th century: Romanticism, idealism, naturalism, symbolism, each bringing its own implicit ideas about science, philosophy, and art. These theorists were essentially taking the prevailing worldviews of their time and applying them to the specific challenge of understanding history. The task, then, becomes figuring out what these different fourfold schemes have in common, while also highlighting their unique emphases and differences. To tackle this, the author proposes a linguistic model. Think of history writing as constructing a language, a universe of discourse, specifically designed to talk about the past. This language has different levels: the lexicon, the basic vocabulary, naming things; grammar, classifying things synchronically, side by side; syntax, showing relationships diachronically over time; and semantics, the meaning of it all. Different historians, according to this view, emphasize different levels. They see different objects, group them differently, explain their connections differently, and tell different stories. So, histories aren't just reports, they're attempts to build distinct linguistic frameworks, distinct ways of talking meaningfully about the past. If we put this linguistic model together, we can see a spectrum. At one extreme, you have the lexical pole, just listing names and dates in chronological order. That's basically a chronicle, potentially very detailed, but lacking deeper structure. At the other extreme, the semantic pole, jumping straight to the ultimate meaning, the grand philosophy of history. This is seen as potentially dangerous or misleading. Where does the academic historian's true history fit? Somewhere in the middle, focusing on the grammatical level of classification or the syntactical level of showing processes over time. Every history operates on all levels, but the emphasis varies. A true account, then, would properly name things, classify them historically, show how they changed using concepts of causation, implying some underlying philosophy, but keeping it implicit, sublimated, or sublated. This displaced philosophy shows up in the choices historians make. Which explanatory framework do they use? Organicism, contextualism, mechanism, formism? And which narrative structure? Romance, comedy, tragedy, satire? These choices reflect underlying assumptions about what matters in history. Critics, then, can identify the ideological element in any given interpretation. The integrity of historiography, its claim to be distinct from pure philosophy, comes from resisting the urge to become purely philosophical or to descend into mere chronicle. And paradoxically, the field's creativity stems from this very diversity: the ability to generate multiple valid accounts of the same events, each highlighting different meanings. Why did professional historians get so defensive about philosophy of history? Because philosophers kept pointing out something uncomfortable. The professional historians were doing philosophy too. They were making choices, using concepts, structuring narratives based on underlying values and assumptions. The philosophers wanted to make these implicit strategies explicit, and more importantly, change the rules of the game. The hostility wasn't just about different methods. It was about a fundamental disagreement about the nature of historical understanding. Marx accused them of servility, bowing to bourgeois science. Nietzsche condemned them for banality, producing Philistine art. Both attacks went beyond methodology to critique the very conception of science or art that underpinned their professionalism. What made Marx and Nietzsche's critique so radical? Unlike earlier philosophers like Comte or Buckle, who tried to borrow tools from science or art and apply them mechanically to historical data, Marx and Nietzsche went deeper. They attacked the very definitions of science and art that the 19th century was working with. By challenging these foundational concepts, they undermined the entire basis upon which academic history had built its professional identity. Think of it like this. History became a game with rules like language. Lexicographers and grammarians defined proper usage. Within that orthodoxy, different stylistic strategies emerged, like those represented by Michelet, Ranke, Tocqueville, and Burckhardt, each claiming their version of realism within the accepted boundaries. But the fact that so many different valid-sounding interpretations existed, all within the same orthodoxy, suggested to sharp minds like Marx and Nietzsche that maybe the rules of the game could be different. Maybe a different universe of discourse was possible. They took this idea and ran with it, pushing the conceptualization of historical knowledge to its logical extremes. Marx focused on critiquing the scientific assumptions, Nietzsche on the artistic ones. In Hegelian terms, they were trying to fulfill the dialectic, take the insights from the various forms of reflective history and use them to build a genuinely philosophical history, one that not only knows about history but knows how it knows, defending its methods philosophically. Both Marx and Nietzsche started by acknowledging the limitations of the official orthodoxy, represented by Ranke, and even the deviations allowed, like Michelet or Tocqueville. They shared a realism that rejected both romantic subjectivity and Enlightenment mechanism, following Hegel's path. But they went further. They saw historical knowledge not just as a methodological problem, but as a problem of consciousness. Crucially, they insisted that understanding the past must serve the present. They weren't interested in detached contemplation. They saw the danger of a purely academic history. They understood perhaps more clearly than anyone else that how we understand the past shapes how we live now. This obsession with the problem of history defined their work. Marx approached this using the language of metonymy, focusing on the interconnectedness of phenomena, especially in his critique of ideology. But his ultimate aim was to show how historical conflicts and divisions could be sublated, overcome and transcended in a future stage of human development. He saw history as moving towards resolution. Think of it as translating the chaotic irony of the present into the tragic struggle of the past, and ultimately resolving it into comedy, a happy ending, a synthesis. His goal was to show a path from conflict to a higher unity. Nietzsche, by contrast, viewed both tragedy and comedy as ironic constructions, illusions created by human consciousness rather than reflections of objective reality. He went further, questioning the very possibility of discovering objective laws in history, arguing that all knowledge serves pre-existing values. His mission was to unmask these myths, to return consciousness to its source in the will to power. He aimed to heal the will, to overcome doubts about our ability to create meaningful, life-affirming conceptions of reality and act upon them. Starting from a view of history as fundamentally chaotic, governed only by the will to power, he envisioned a final redemption not as collective salvation, but as individual self-overcoming, a romantic drama of becoming the Superman, transcending the limitations of the historical man. Liberation from history meant liberation from the herd mentality. Interestingly, both Marx and Nietzsche, despite their differences, were ultimately optimists in a way their contemporaries weren't. Ranke's optimism lacked theoretical grounding, Michelet's was pure feeling. Tocqueville and Burckhardt were pessimistic. Marx and Nietzsche, however, believed a healthy historical life could emerge from suffering. They criticized the simplistic optimism of the Romantics and the despair of the pessimists. They sought to return historical thought to its core, either as a science for Marx or an art for Nietzsche. Their revisions of Hegel and Schopenhauer were aimed at achieving synthetic thought, a way to construct a clear grammar and syntax for understanding history, whether scientifically or artistically. So, where did this leave the concept of objectivity? For Marx, the problem was about finding the right mode of explanation to scientifically characterize history. For Nietzsche, it was about choosing the right mode of employment to creatively interpret a seemingly lawless field. Both recognized that the choice between these different strategies couldn't be objectively justified by appealing to some neutral external criterion. There was no value-free ground. This realization forced them to confront the very meaning of objectivity itself. And that's perhaps their greatest contribution to the crisis of historicism. By showing that the choice of interpretive framework and narrative mode is fundamental, and that these choices aren't objectively determined, they historicized objectivity itself. Suddenly, objectivity wasn't this fixed standard you could just apply. Instead, the nature of objectivity became a question historians had to grapple with, realizing it was itself historically contingent and value-laden. That's a profound shift, challenging the very idea of a neutral historical science.